Have you ever seen someone get exactly what they deserved? My stepdad Gary was having his stupid Super Bowl party when I noticed the downstairs toilet making this gurgling sound like it was possessed by a demon. I told him we needed to call a plumber right now because something was wrong with the pipes. But Gary laughed and said I didn't know anything about home ownership because I was just a freeloading kid living in his house. He actually made air quotes when he said emergency and told his idiot friends that I probably clogged it with too much toilet paper like a little princess, and they all laughed while I stood there turning red. 20 minutes later, the toilet was literally bubbling like a witch's cauldron, and the smell was making people gag. But Gary just sprayed an entire can of Febreze and announced that real men don't need plumbers. When I tried to show him the water rising dangerously close to the rim, he grabbed my phone and said if I called anyone or embarrassed him in front of his guests, he'd take away my car keys for a month and tell my mom I'd been sneaking girls into the house. That's when I realized Gary cared more about his ego than the fact that we were about to have a literal crap tsunami in the house he loved more than his own family. The toilet was making these deep rumbling sounds like a volcano about to erupt, and brownish water was starting to seep around the base onto his precious bathroom tiles that he'd spent 3 months picking out. I ran to the garage to find the water shutoff valve, while Gary stood in the bathroom with a plunger, telling his drunk friends that he'd been fixing toilets since before I was born and didn't need some teenager teaching him about plumbing. He was literally lecturing them about how his father never called professionals for anything, while jabbing the plunger up and down like he was harpooning a whale, and each thrust made the water rise higher and higher. His best friend Kyle was recording it on his phone, saying Gary was a real man who could handle anything, and Gary was eating it up, flexing his muscles while plunging and saying, "This is how a homeowner takes care of business." The toilet made this unholy shrieking sound, and Gary just plunged harder, saying it was almost fixed, and everyone should watch the master at work. I found the shutoff valve, but it was painted over and wouldn't budge, so I grabbed a wrench while listening to Gary upstairs telling everyone about how plumbers were scam artists who charged $500 just to use a plunger that cost $10 at the hardware store. He actually brought his friends into the bathroom to show them his technique, and they stood around drinking beer while sewage water lapped at their shoes like they were at the world's worst beach. Gary started telling this story about how he'd fixed a toilet at his ex-wife's house just to make her new husband look stupid, and everyone was laughing while the toilet literally started overflowing onto their feet. His friend Kevin suggested maybe they should move to another room, and Gary called him a pussy and said real men don't run from toilets. Then he grabbed another beer and poured some into the toilet, saying it would loosen things up. The water in the toilet had turned black and was swirling like a nightmare, and Gary's friend Mike was backing toward the door saying maybe they should call someone, but Gary accused him of not being a real friend and started questioning his manhood. That's when Gary made the stupidest decision of his stupid life and flushed the toilet to clear the system, and the water rose up like a geyser of pure evil. Everyone started screaming and running, but Gary stood his ground with the plunger, yelling that he had it under control while brown water poured over the rim and across the floor. The smell hit everyone at once, and 2 of his friends actually threw up, which made everything worse, and Gary was slipping in the sewage while still trying to plunge and maintain his dignity. He screamed at me that this was somehow my fault for not maintaining the toilet properly, like I was the one who owned this house and refused to do basic maintenance for 5 years. I was still fighting with the shutoff valve, while Gary tried to use bath towels to build a dam in the hallway, but the towels just turned into sewage sponges that made squishing sounds when you stepped on them. We heard this deep rumbling from inside the walls that sounded like the house was growling, and sewage started coming up through the shower drain and the sink, but Gary still wouldn't let anyone call a plumber. He actually took someone's phone and threw it in the sewage when they tried to look up emergency plumbers, saying he'd rather burn the house down than admit defeat to a toilet. The bathroom was flooding with chunky brown water that was flowing into the hallway toward his man cave, and Gary dropped the plunger and ran to save his signed football jerseys. He was literally crying about his memorabilia while standing ankle-deep in human waste, and his friends were filming everything while gagging from the smell. Gary turned to me with pure hatred in his eyes and said this was all my fault for mentioning it in the first place, that if I'd just kept my mouth shut, none of this would have happened. Then he said when my mom got home, he was going to tell her I'd deliberately sabotaged his party because I was jealous of him being the man of the house. That's when the pipe in the wall made a sound like a gunshot, and I saw the drywall start to buckle outward. Through the growing crack came a jet of dark brown sewage aimed directly at Gary's man cave, where he kept his signed jerseys, his vintage beer signs, and that 80-inch TV he wouldn't let anyone else touch. Gary's face went from rage to complete horror as he realized exactly what was about to happen to everything he loved. The pipe burst with a sound like thunder, and sewage exploded through the drywall in a thick brown jet that hit Gary's signed jerseys dead center. Gary screamed and tried to run toward his precious collection, but his feet went out from under him on the slick floor, and he landed hard on his back with a wet splat. The sewage kept blasting through the hole in the wall like a fire hose made of pure evil, spraying across his 80-inch TV and coating everything in chunky brown sludge. Kyle held his phone up higher to get a better angle, while Gary flopped around on the floor like a fish, trying to get up but slipping every time he moved. I ran back to the garage and grabbed a hammer, slamming it against the painted-over shutoff valve until something cracked and the handle finally started to turn. The valve was so tight I had to use both hands and all my weight, but it slowly moved and I could hear the water pressure dropping in the pipes. By the time I got back inside, Gary's entire man cave was flooded with 3 inches of sewage, and he was sitting in the middle of of it, holding a dripping jersey and actually crying. His friends were all recording from the hallway, trying not to laugh but failing, and Gary didn't even notice because he was staring at his ruined collection like someone had died. Kyle was already typing on his phone, and I saw him post the video with the caption, "Gary versus toilet," and within seconds, people were liking and sharing it. The smell hit us like a physical force, and everyone started gagging and running for the door, with Mike actually puking in the kitchen sink on his way out. Gary finally looked up at me with tears streaming down his face and said we needed to call someone right now, which was exactly what I'd been saying for the past hour. I grabbed Kevin's phone, since mine was still somewhere in the sewage, and found an emergency plumber while everyone else evacuated to the front yard. The dispatcher said someone could be there within an hour for triple the normal rate, and I said yes, without even asking Gary, because at this point, money was the least of our problems. Gary stumbled out of the house covered head to toe in sewage, his clothes soaked and dripping, and collapsed on the front lawn, while his friends stood around filming and laughing. That's when Mom's car pulled into the driveway, and she got out with a confused look that quickly turned to horror as she saw the brown water flowing out the front door. She looked at Gary lying on the grass, then at me standing there with Kevin's phone, then at the house with sewage pouring out, and her face went from confused to absolutely furious. I quickly explained how I'd tried to call a plumber, but Gary had threatened to take my car keys and tell her I was sneaking girls in, and Mom's eyes narrowed to slits as she turned to look at Gary. The emergency plumber Joe Foley showed up in a big van with 24/7 emergency service painted on the side and immediately started putting on rubber boots and gloves. She took one look at the sewage flowing out of the house and shook her head, saying this was a main sewer line backup that had been building for a long time. Joe explained that the whole system had probably been backing up for weeks or months, and Gary's aggressive plunging just created enough pressure to blow the pipe. She quoted us $8,000 for emergency service, line clearing, and temporary pumping just to prevent more damage to the house. Gary tried to argue about the price from his spot on the lawn, saying it was highway robbery, but Mom shut him down immediately and told Joe to do whatever was necessary. Mom said Gary's stupidity had already cost way more than $8,000, and if he said another word about money, she'd make him sleep in the garage. Joe brought in a huge power auger and started working on the main line while I went back inside with rubber gloves to see what could be saved. Gary's signed jerseys were completely destroyed, soaked through with sewage that would never come out no matter how many times you washed them. How did Gary think plunging harder would fix a problem that was clearly getting worse with every push? The way the toilet went from gurgling to exploding makes me wonder if the pipes had been blocked for months. Did nobody notice warning signs before this? It's so interesting how he chose his pride over his precious man cave. His vintage beer signs were contaminated beyond saving, the metal corroded, and the paint already bubbling from the bacteria in the waste. The 80-inch TV was sitting in 3 inches of sewage, and when I tried to lift it, brown water poured out of the vents, and I knew it was completely fried. I dragged what I could out to the driveway, but everything smelled so bad that even outside you could barely stand to be near it. The neighbors started showing up to complain about the smell and ask if the sewage might spread to their properties through connected pipes. One of them mentioned calling the HOA about health code violations, since raw sewage was literally flowing into the street, which made Gary panic about fines. Joe came out after an hour with her camera scope and showed us pictures from inside the pipes that made everyone feel sick. The sewer line was completely clogged with years of grease buildup that looked like gray stalactites hanging from the pipe walls. She found massive root intrusions where tree roots had broken through the pipe joints and created a web that caught everything flowing through. Joe pointed to white clumps in the photos and said those were supposedly flushable wipes that weren't actually flushable and had been building up for years. She showed us where the pipe had been slowly collapsing from the weight of the blockage and said this disaster was inevitable after years of neglect. Mom grabbed her phone and started dialing the insurance company while Gary stumbled out to the front steps, still dripping with sewage that left brown stains on the concrete. His friends were already getting into their cars, windows rolled down because they couldn't stand the smell on their clothes. Kyle held up his phone and showed Gary the video already had 300 views in just the last 10 minutes. Gary's shoulders slumped as car after car pulled away, leaving tire marks on the wet driveway where sewage had leaked out. I ran upstairs and grabbed every towel from the linen closet, throwing them down at the edge of the hallway to stop the sewage from reaching the living room carpet. Mom watched me working while she waited on hold, nodding at me with this look that said she finally saw who was really responsible in this house. Gary just sat there on the steps with his head in his hands, not even trying to help as I used our good beach towels to soak up human waste. Joe worked her power auger deeper into the main line, the machine making grinding sounds as it chewed through years of buildup and tree roots. After another hour, she pulled out chunks of gray grease mixed with wet wipes and showed us how bad the damage really was. She wrote up an estimate on her clipboard and handed it to Mom. $20,000 for complete line replacement that should have been done 5 years ago. Mom's face went pale, but she just nodded and asked Joe to do whatever was needed to stop the immediate flooding. The insurance company finally answered, and Mom explained the situation while pacing back and forth in the front yard, stepping around puddles of contaminated water. They said they'd send an emergency adjuster named Brent Finley, who could be there by 7 that evening to assess the damage. Joe managed to clear enough of the main blockage that the active flooding stopped, but brown water still sat in pools throughout the basement. She packed up her equipment and told us not to go downstairs without protective gear because of the bacteria and parasites in raw sewage. Brent Finley showed up right at 7, a thin guy with glasses who took one look at our flooded basement and started shaking his head. He took photos of the collapsed pipe sections and the years of mineral deposits that proved this wasn't sudden damage, but long-term neglect. Gary tried to explain that he'd been meaning to get it fixed, but Brent just kept taking pictures and making notes on his tablet. The smell in the house was so bad that Brent said we couldn't stay there overnight because of health risks from the toxic fumes. Mom called around to find a motel, while Brent explained that breathing sewage fumes could cause serious respiratory problems and infections. We packed overnight bags and drove to a cheap motel on the edge of town. Mom and Gary in one room, me in another. I finally had some peace and quiet, lying on the clean motel bed while Gary had to sit in his sewage-stained clothes next door. The next morning, we met a decontamination crew at the house. 5 guys in white hazmat suits with respirators and heavy-duty cleaning equipment. The crew leader walked through the basement with a clipboard, pointing out how everything down there was contaminated and would need to be stripped to the studs. Gary ran downstairs before they could stop him, trying to grab his signed jerseys from the wall where they hung in sewage-soaked frames. The crew leader explained that anything touched by sewage was a biohazard and had to be disposed of according to health regulations. Gary watched them throw his prized possessions into thick plastic hazmat bags, while neighbors stood in their driveways watching the whole scene. They loaded bag after bag of Gary's memorabilia into a truck marked with biohazard symbols, each bag making a wet thud as it landed. Meanwhile, my phone was blowing up with messages about the video, which had been shared thousands of times overnight with new memes every hour. Someone had made a remix with techno music, and Gary's voice saying, "Real men don't need plumbers," on repeat over the beat. Kids at the school were already texting me Gary's quotes about being the man of the house while standing in literal crap. My friend Jake sent me a screenshot where someone had turned Gary into a meme template with the caption, "When you're too proud to admit you're wrong." The decontamination crew worked all day, ripping out drywall and insulation that had absorbed sewage, filling dumpster after dumpster with contaminated materials. Gary stood in the driveway watching them destroy his man cave piece by piece, not saying a word as they carried out his beer sign collection in bags. Brent Finley came back that afternoon with his final assessment, pulling Mom and Gary aside to deliver the insurance verdict. He explained they'd cover basic structural cleanup but not personal property damaged by neglected maintenance, which meant all of Gary's memorabilia was a total loss. The deductible would be $5,000, and our premiums were definitely going up, probably doubling based on the claim size and negligence factors. Mom's face got tight as she did the math in her head, adding up the $20,000 for new pipes, plus the deductible plus everything insurance wouldn't cover. That evening, I heard Mom and Gary in the motel room next door having a serious conversation about money, their voices carrying through the thin walls. Mom was saying they'd have to drain their entire vacation fund and probably sell Gary's boat to cover all the costs. Gary tried to blame me again, saying if I hadn't made such a big deal about the toilet, none of this would have happened. Mom shut him down hard, telling him his pride and stupidity had cost them everything, and if he tried to blame me one more time, she'd leave. The next morning, the decontamination crew called Mom's cell with bad news about what they'd found behind the bathroom walls. The crew leader said when they pulled out the wet drywall, they discovered black mold spreading through the studs from years of small leaks Gary never fixed. He showed Mom photos on his tablet of fuzzy black growth covering everything behind the walls like some kind of toxic carpet. The mold remediation alone would add another $10,000 to our cleanup bill because they'd have to seal off the area and use special equipment. Mom's hands were shaking as she looked at the estimate, and I could see her doing the math in her head of how much this disaster was really going to cost us. Gary sat on the motel bed staring at the floor while the crew leader explained how the mold had probably been growing for at least 3 years. Every time Gary had sprayed paint over water stains or just ignored small leaks, he'd been feeding this hidden monster behind our walls. The crew would need hazmat suits and respirators just to clean it out. Plus, we'd need air quality testing afterward to make sure it was safe. I went back to the school that Monday expecting everyone to laugh at me for the viral video, but something weird happened instead. Kids were coming up to me in the hallway saying they saw me trying to warn Gary and thought I handled it perfectly. My friend Jake showed me comments on the video where people were calling me the only smart one in the whole situation. Teachers who'd seen it were giving me these knowing looks, and my history teacher actually said I showed good judgment under pressure. The video had over 2 million views now, and someone had made a compilation of all the times I tried to prevent the disaster. Kids were quoting Gary's stupid lines about real men not needing plumbers, but they were laughing at him, not me. Even the popular kids were treating me different, like I'd earned some kind of respect for standing up to a stubborn adult. That afternoon, Mom made Gary call his brother Tom to ask for money since our savings wouldn't cover everything. I could hear Gary from the other room struggling to get the words out as he explained what happened to his brother. Tom must have already seen the video because Gary kept saying it wasn't as bad as it looked and the video didn't show the whole story. Gary's voice cracked when he had to admit he'd ignored basic maintenance for years and now needed $20,000. Mom stood in the doorway watching him with her arms crossed, making sure he told the truth about everything. Gary had to explain about the mold, the insurance problems, and how much the new pipes would cost, while his brother apparently laughed on the other end. Gary's trying to save those jerseys from the sewage makes me wonder if he really understands what just happened here. The way he keeps blaming everyone else while standing in actual human waste shows there's something deeper going on with his need to be right all the time. After 10 minutes of begging, Tom agreed to loan us the money, but I heard him say Gary would be paying him back with interest. Joe Foley came back Wednesday to install a back backflow preventer that would stop this from ever happening again. She walked Mom through the whole system, showing her where the cleanout access was and how to check for problems. Mom took notes on her phone and asked a ton of questions, while Gary sat in his truck refusing to come inside. Joe gave Mom a maintenance schedule that she immediately printed out and stuck on the fridge with magnets. Mom announced that from now on, she was handling all household maintenance decisions, and Gary wouldn't have any say in it. Joe showed me how to check the water pressure gauge and where the main shutoff was in case of future emergencies. She even gave Mom her personal cell number and said to call immediately if we noticed any plumbing issues. Thursday brought a certified letter from the HOA with a violation notice about the smell and visible damage to our property. They'd received multiple complaints from neighbors about the sewage odor and the industrial dumpsters in our driveway. The letter gave us 30 days to complete all repairs or face daily fines of $200. Gary had to go to a hearing the next week where the HOA board would review our case and determine if we were negligent. Someone had already sent them the viral video as evidence, and the letter mentioned it specifically as proof of homeowner negligence. Gary turned white when he read that part, realizing the video would follow him everywhere now. The HOA president lived 3 houses down and had already told other neighbors that Gary was an idiot who destroyed his own house. Friday morning, Gary's boss called him into the office because several clients had seen the video and were asking questions. His company did business consulting, and clients were wondering how they could trust Gary's judgment after seeing him ignore obvious warning signs. His boss made him attend sensitivity training about listening to other people's input and respecting different opinions. Gary had to sit through 8 hours of training videos about toxic masculinity and the importance of admitting when you need help. The trainer actually used Gary's video as an example of what not to do in a crisis situation. His co-workers kept sending him memes from the video, and someone had put a plunger in his office as a joke. Gary came home that night looking defeated, and for once he didn't say a single word during dinner. By the end of the week, the decontamination crew had finished their work, but our basement was completely destroyed. They'd stripped everything down to concrete floors and bare wall studs, taking out every bit of drywall, insulation, and flooring. Gary finally went downstairs to look at what used to be his man cave, and I watched him stand there staring at the empty space. The room where he'd spent every weekend watching sports and drinking beer was now just exposed framing and concrete. You could see every pipe and wire running through the ceiling, and chalk marks showed where new drywall would eventually go. Gary picked up a piece of broken concrete from where his recliner used to sit and just held it in his hand. The signed jerseys, the vintage beer signs, the huge TV, everything he'd collected for 20 years was gone forever. Mom came home with a printed list of new household rules that she taped next to the maintenance schedule on the fridge. Every maintenance concern would be addressed within 24 hours, no exceptions or delays allowed. She would control the emergency fund in a separate account that only she could access. Gary lost his veto power over any household decisions, and I would have equal say in anything affecting the family. Mom also started a maintenance log where we'd record every repair, service call, and inspection with dates and costs. Gary just nodded when she explained the new system, not even trying to argue or defend himself anymore. We moved back into the house after 2 weeks in the motel, but the place still smelled weird. It was this mix of sewage and industrial disinfectant that hit you as soon as you walked in the door. Gary hadn't been down to the basement since the crew finished gutting it, and he'd been eating dinner in silence. He used to lecture us during meals about being the man of the house, but now he just stared at his plate. Mom had taken over paying bills and managing the contractor bids for rebuilding the basement. I noticed Gary's beer was gone from the fridge, and he'd been going to bed at 9 instead of staying up watching TV. The final straw came when Mom told Gary he had to attend anger management classes or she would file for divorce. She'd already looked up therapists and found one who specialized in toxic masculinity and control issues. Gary tried to say therapy was for weak people, but Mom pulled out her phone and showed him the lawyer's number she'd already saved. He agreed to go, probably because he knew Mom was dead serious about leaving if he didn't change. The first session was next Tuesday, and Mom said she'd be checking with the therapist to make sure Gary actually showed up. 2 days later, Mom sat me down at the kitchen table and slid my car keys across to me, along with a new gas card that had my name on it. She told me she was sorry for not backing me up when Gary threatened to take my keys, and that she should have stood up to him years ago. I could see she really meant it because her eyes were getting watery, and she kept fidgeting with her wedding ring like she was thinking about taking it off. The contractor showed up that same afternoon with a crew to start rebuilding the basement, and Mom walked them through her plans for turning Gary's man cave into a family room. Gary stood in the doorway watching her point to where she wanted built-in shelves instead of his sports memorabilia wall, but he didn't say a single word. The contractor asked if Gary had any input, and he just shook his head and went upstairs to watch TV in the bedroom. 3 weeks after the sewage disaster, Gary came up to me while I was doing homework and mumbled something about being sorry for not listening when I tried to warn him. It wasn't a great apology because he still called it bad luck instead of taking full responsibility, but at least he admitted I'd been right about calling a plumber. He looked smaller somehow, like the whole thing had shrunk him down from the big tough guy he used to pretend to be. Joe came back to do the final plumbing inspection, and she brought this fancy camera that could see inside all the pipes to make sure everything was flowing right. She showed us the footage on her tablet and joked that we were her most famous clients because people still asked her about the viral video of Gary fighting the toilet. Gary actually laughed a little bit, which surprised me because usually he'd get mad about being reminded of his failure. The new pipes were perfect, and Joe gave us this certificate saying our plumbing system was completely up to code, which Mom immediately framed and hung hung in the kitchen. Gary's friends started coming around again after about a month, but things were different because they didn't automatically agree with everything he said anymore. Kevin came over to watch a game, and when Gary started complaining about the contractor's work, Kevin actually told him he should have listened to me from the start. Gary just nodded and changed the subject instead of arguing like he used to do when someone disagreed with him. Mom started teaching me about home maintenance, and we'd spend Saturday mornings checking the water heater, cleaning gutters, and doing all the stuff Gary used to claim only he could handle. Gary would sit upstairs watching TV while we worked, and sometimes I'd catch him looking out the window at us, but he never came down to interfere or tell us we were doing it wrong. Mom showed me how to read the water meter and check for leaks, and she explained how insurance worked and why regular maintenance was cheaper than emergency repairs. The insurance company finally sent their final settlement check, which only covered about half of what we'd spent on the cleanup and repairs. Mom told Gary he needed to sell his boat to cover the rest, and he listed it online that same day without arguing or trying to negotiate. The boat sold within a week to some guy who drove up from 2 states away, and Gary signed over the title without even trying to haggle for more money. At the school, I'd become kind of famous as the kid who tried to stop the sewage disaster and actually stood up to my stepdad about it. People I'd never talked to before started saying hi in the hallways, and this girl in my chemistry class said she thought it was cool that I'd tried to do the right thing even when Gary threatened me. I made friends with this kid whose dad was a contractor, and he said his dad had heard about our disaster through the industry grapevine. A couple weeks later, I heard this weird clicking sound coming from the water heater and told Gary about it. Instead of dismissing me like before, he actually came to look at it and asked what I thought we should do about it. We called a repair guy together, and it turned out to be a minor issue with the heating element that could have turned into a major problem if we'd ignored it. Gary thanked me for catching it early, and I could tell he actually meant it this time. Mom called a family meeting where she announced she was taking over all the finances, and Gary would get a monthly allowance for his personal spending. She'd set up separate accounts for bills, maintenance, and emergencies that only she could access, and Gary would need to ask her for money for anything beyond his allowance. Gary just sat there nodding while she explained the new system, and when she asked if he had any questions, he said no, and that it was probably for the best. I could tell he was actually relieved not to be responsible for the money anymore, because his shoulders relaxed for the first time since the disaster. Joe bringing that special camera to check inside the pipes is so cool. I wonder if she could see exactly where the old problems were and how different the new pipes look. The basement renovation was moving along, and Mom had picked out nice carpet and paint colors that made it feel like a real family space instead of Gary's personal kingdom. The contractor finished the basement 3 weeks later, and Mom walked through inspecting every corner while Gary stayed upstairs watching TV. She hung our family photos right where Gary's signed jerseys used to be, arranging them in neat rows while I helped her hammer in the nails. Gary came down once to get a beer from the new mini fridge and saw his jerseys replaced with pictures of us at the beach, my graduation, and Mom's parents who died before I was born. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds staring at the wall, then grabbed his beer and went back upstairs without saying anything. The new carpet was this soft gray color that made the room feel bigger and brighter than Gary's old dark cave. Mom had picked out a big sectional couch that faced a normal-sized TV mounted on the wall where Gary's huge screen used to dominate everything. She put board games in the cabinet where Gary kept his beer collection and replaced his neon signs with actual lamps that gave off warm light. The insurance letter came 6 weeks after the disaster with our new premium that was almost double what we'd been paying before. Mom sat me down at the kitchen table and showed me all the policy details, explaining deductibles and coverage limits, while Gary pretended to read the newspaper. She made me understand how neglecting maintenance could void coverage and why we needed to document everything with photos and receipts. Gary kept glancing over but didn't interrupt, even when Mom said this was what happened when people were ignored problems until they exploded. I took notes while she explained how insurance companies investigate claims and why they'd almost denied ours completely. She showed me the adjuster's report that listed years of deferred maintenance and said we were lucky to get anything at all. Gary came home from anger management the next Tuesday and actually asked if we could talk in the living room. He sat on the edge of the couch with his hands folded and told me his therapist made him write a list of times his pride hurt other people. He said the sewage disaster was #1 on a list of 37 incidents where he should have listened instead of assuming he knew better. His voice cracked a little when he admitted he'd been scared of looking weak in front of his friends, and that's why he acted so stupid. He didn't exactly apologize, but he said he understood now that respect goes both ways, and he hadn't been giving me any. I told him thanks for saying that, and he nodded before going to the garage to organize his tools, which was his way of dealing with emotions. Mom announced that Friday would be family game night in the new basement, and we'd be playing cards and board games together. Gary actually showed up without complaining and sat at the game table she'd bought to replace his poker table. We played Uno first, and when Gary lost 3 hands in a row, he just laughed instead of getting mad or making excuses. Mom beat him at Scrabble, and he congratulated her instead of claiming she cheated or the game was stupid. I won at Monopoly after Gary went bankrupt, and he actually high-fived me instead of flipping the board like he would have before. The summer job acceptance letter came the next week for a paid internship at an engineering firm downtown. Gary started to say it would interfere with helping him with yard work, but Mom cut him off immediately, saying this was a great opportunity. She told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything and that she trusted my judgment about my future. Gary just nodded and mumbled something about needing to check the lawnmower while Mom helped me fill out the paperwork. She even offered to drive me on my first day since Gary would need the truck for work. 2 months after the Super Bowl disaster, the the viral video views finally started slowing down from millions to just thousands per day. Gary's co-workers still called him Plunger Man, but he'd learned to laugh along instead of getting defensive or angry. He even made a joke about it at the hardware store when the clerk recognized him from the video. Instead of denying it or getting mad, Gary said at least he was famous for something, even if it was being an idiot. The clerk laughed and gave him a discount on the new pipe fittings he was buying for preventive maintenance. Our family dinners became actual conversations instead of Gary lecturing while Mom and I ate in silence. Mom started making decisions about home repairs, and Gary would offer input but not override her choices anymore. I got to vote on things like what color to paint the garage door and whether we should get a new dishwasher. Gary still had opinions, but he'd present them as suggestions instead of commands that had to be followed. The power balance had completely shifted with Mom as the clear head of household and Gary accepting his new position. 3 months after that horrible Super Bowl Sunday, I realized that Gary getting covered in sewage was the best thing that could have happened. His pride got flushed away along with his man cave, and he had to rebuild himself from nothing. Mom found her voice after years of letting Gary dominate every decision, and she wasn't giving it up again. I went from being treated like an unwanted guest to having an actual say in my own home. The disaster cost us thousands of dollars, but it saved our family from years more of Gary's toxic need to be the big man. Sometimes you really do need a literal shitstorm to wash away all the crap and start fresh with something better. Thanks for hanging out and questioning things with me. It's always interesting wondering through all this stuff together. I'll see you around next time. And hey, if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.